My name is Patrícia García de Mendoza, and I'm going to present Getting to Yes. First of all, I think we should talk about negotiating, which is a part of our everyday life. Everyone negotiates something every day. For instance, we discuss a raise with our boss, or we try to agree with a stranger on a price for a house. But people find themselves in a dilemma, which is that they see two ways of negotiate, soft or hard. The soft one wants to avoid personal conflict and he wants an amicable resolution, and the hard negotiator sees any situation as a contest of wills. However, there is a third way to negotiate, which is the method of principled negotiation, developed at the Harvard Negotiation Project, and it's to decide issues on their merits rather than through a haggling process, focused on what each side says it will and won't do. So this methodology has basically 4 steps. The first one is to separate the people from the problem. The second one focuses on interests and not in positions. The third one generates a variety of possibilities before deciding what to do. And the fourth one insists that the result be based on some objective standard. So the first step of this methodology is separate the people from the problem. This means that negotiations are people's first, because when we are dealing with a negotiator, we are dealing with a human being, not with an abstract representation of the other side. Another important point is that every negotiator has 2 kinds of interests, in the substance and in the relationship. Every negotiator wants to reach an agreement that satisfies his substantive interests. That is why one negotiates, but beyond that, a negotiator also has an interest in his relationship with the other side. Another important point is that separate the relationship from the substance. Deal directly with the people problem, because we have to base the relationship on accurate perceptions, clear communication, appropriate emotions, and a forward-looking purposive outlook. Then, another thing to highlight is perception. We have to understand the other side's thinking. We have to put ourselves in their shoes, discuss each other's perceptions, look for opportunities to act inconsistently with their perceptions, and give them a stake in the outcome by making sure they participate in the process. Then we also have emotion, that in a negotiation, particularly in a bitter dispute, feelings may be more important than talk. So we have to recognize and understand emotions, theirs and yours. We have to make sure that emotions are explicit and acknowledge them as legitimate. We have to allow the other side to let off the steam and don't react to emotional outbursts. And finally, use symbolic gestures if it is necessary, for instance, an apology. Then we also have communication. And without communication, there is no negotiation, because negotiation is a process of communicating back and forth for the purpose of reaching a joint decision. The unique problem is that there are 3 big problems in communication. One is that negotiators may not be talking to each other, or at least not in such a way as to be understood. The second one is that often people don't seem to pay enough attention to what you say. And the third one is misunderstanding, which is very common. So in this case, we should listen actively and acknowledge what the others say. We have to speak to be understood, and we have to speak for a purpose. And then the final point here is that prevention works best. This means building a personal and organizational relationship with the other side that can cushion the people on each side against the knocks of a negotiation. The second step of this methodology would be focus on interests, not positions. In this case, for a wise solution, reconcile interests and not positions. This means that interests define the problem, and sometimes behind opposed positions lie shared and compatible interests, as well as conflicting ones that we might not know about before. Then, how do we identify interests? That would be asking the question why, and also asking the question why not, and this would help us realize that each side has multiple interests. In fact, the most powerful interests are basic human needs, like, for instance, security, economic well-being, a sense of belonging, recognition, control over one's lives. And as fundamental as they seem, basic human needs sometimes are easy to overlook. Then another important point here would be talking about interests, because the purpose of a negotiation is to serve your interests, and the chance of that happening increases when we communicate them. So we have to make our interests come alive, acknowledge their interests as part of the problem, Put the problem before our answer, look forward, not back, and be concrete but flexible. Also, the last point would be hard on the problem and soft on the people. Then we have the third step in this methodology, which would be invent options for mutual gain. And a great example of this would be the case of Israel and Egypt negotiating over who should keep how much of the Sinai Peninsula, which illustrates a major problem in negotiation and also a key opportunity. This problem is a common one because, as the author says, there seems to be no way to split the pie that leaves both parties satisfied. And this in an example makes clear the opportunity. A creative option, like a demilitarized Sinai, can often make the difference between deadlock or an agreement. To do this, we have to follow some steps. The first one is diagnosis. In most negotiations, there are 4 obstacles that inhibit us to make a lot of options. The first one is premature judgment. Under the pressure of a forthcoming negotiation, our critical sense normally is sharper. Then we have searching for the single answer, which would be premature closure, which is something that we shouldn't have to do. Then we have the assumption of a fixed pie. For instance, a third explanation for why there may be so few good options on the table is that each side sees the situation as essentially either or. Either they get the dispute or we do. And finally, thinking that solving the problem is their problem. And that is not true, because for a negotiator to reach an agreement that meets his own self-interest, he needs to develop a solution. Then we have another step in this process, which is prescription. To invent creative options, we will need to separate the act of inventing options from the act of judging them. In this case, we would need a brainstorming session. Before brainstorming, we should define our purpose, choose a few participants, change the environment, design an informal atmosphere, and choose a facilitator. Then we should start brainstorming. This should be done by sitting the participants side by side, facing the problem, clarifying the ground rules, including the non-criticism rule, and then record the ideas in full view. And finally, after brainstorming, we have to start the most promising ideas and set up a time to evaluate the ideas and decide. Then another step in this prescription phase would be broaden our options. A way to do this and to multiply our options would be the circle chart. The circle chart is the task of inventing options, which involves 4 types of thinking. One is thinking about a particular problem, then doing a descriptive analysis, then considering what has to be done, and then come up with any specific and feasible suggestions for action. This helps us look through the different eyes of different experts and change the scope of our proposed agreement. Another point here would be look for mutual gain. This means identify shared interests and ask for the preferences of the other side. And finally, we have to make their decision easy. We have to think about this. We have to see that negotiation depends upon the other side making a decision we want. So we should do whatever we can to make that decision an easy one. And finally, the 4th step in this methodology would be insist on using objective criteria. In this sense, we have deciding on the basis of will is costly, because no negotiation is likely to be efficient or amicable if we pit our will against theirs. Also, it is important to use objective criteria, because the approach is to commit yourself to reaching a solution based on principle, not pressure. Then we have to develop objective criteria. This can be done through fair standards and fair procedures. And finally, negotiating with objective criteria, which we have 3 basic points to remember in the sense. One is frame each issue as a joint search for objective criteria, and then reason and be open to reason, and then never yield to pressure. Pressure such as like a bribe, a threat, a manipulative appeal to trust, or just a simple refusal to budge. But then, after all the steps of this methodology, we could think, what if they are more powerful? So in this sense, we have to protect ourselves. We have to think that using a bottom line can inhibit imagination, and maybe it is probably that it's likely to be set too high. Then we have to know our BATNA, which is the best alternative to negotiated agreements. And then we have to formulate a tripwire, because although our BATNA is the true measure by which we should judge any proposed agreement, we may want another test as well, and this tripwire should provide us with some margin in reserve. Then we should make the most of our assets. We have to know our BATNA, because the better we know it, the greater is our power. Then we have to develop it, and we also have to consider the other side's BATNA, really important. And finally, when the other side is powerful, and we have to think that the stronger they appear in terms of physical or economic power, the more we benefit by negotiating on the merits. Another doubt that arises is, what if they won't play? If they won't play, we have to think about three basic approaches, which is what you can do, what they can do, and what the third party can do. Then we also have to think about negotiation jiu-jitsu. And the principles of this negotiation jiu-jitsu would be: don't attack their position, look behind it, don't defend your ideas but invite criticism and advice, don't recast an attack on you as an attack on the problem, and finally ask questions and pause. And finally, in this sense, we also have to consider the one text procedure, which is when a third party learns about both parties' needs and interests and finds them a solution. And the last question to think about is, what if they use dirty tricks? So if they use dirty tricks, we have to negotiate the rules of the game. We have to recognize the tactic, raise the issue explicitly, and finally question the tactic's legitimacy and desirability. Then some common tricky tactics would be, first of all, deliberate deception, and inside deliberate deception we have ambiguous authority and obvious intentions. Then we have psychological warfare, and inside this we have stressful situations, personal attacks, the good guy versus the bad guy routine, and threats. And finally, positional pressure tactics, which would be refusal to negotiate, extreme demands, escalating demands, lock-in tactics, hard-hearted partner, a calculated delay, and the take it or leave it phrase. And finally, and the most important thing, don't be a victim, because you can be just as firm as they can, even firmer, and it is easier to defend principle than an illegitimate tactic, so don't be a victim. And that is my presentation. Thank you.